Hello everyone, today we talk about Caesar's dictatorship. So we're talking about 48-44 BC. This is surprisingly the first time we dedicated video to Caesar. Specifically, we talked extensively about the Gallic Wars. We'll come back on topic, and surely we'll be making at least, I think, tens of videos about Caesar, because it's one of those figures that you can't really even begin to describe in earnest, let's say, from an historical point of view, without entering some important details, and from one side, appreciating, of course, the limits of our understanding, of our knowledge, of our information for these times in history, so that, let's say, everybody has an opinion on such characters because they left a mark in world history. So it's impossible for them not to be popularized, not to have some bias even. On the other hand, there is definitely a lot that we can know historically speaking, not much just about the person, the character, but specifically the context where it was operating, and that's definitely one of the most important helps in any kind of historical situation. It is to give a proper background to and context to everything you're discussing. Today, it's just a few notes, right? This is not even actually an introduction to the figure of Caesar, which would be, and I doubt I'll ever make a video with such focus, right? I have my own opinions on the character. I essentially discourage, at least as a key of interpretation, to evaluate these Roman warlords, such as the ones made up, in fact, the first triumvirate, but more generally, here we are in the phase of necrosis of the Roman Republic, right? Since Sulla, at least. But even this is exactly the point that I've seen many people, because during the years I've been here and there, read here and there, seen here and there, and I realize, even just through social networks, media, etc., there is a sort of projection of modern values and standards, such as believing, I don't know, that the populares were the left and the optimates were the right. It was nothing of that, right? They were all pursuing the same identical objective, just using different, not even properly policies, but just making leverage on different classes with different symbolism, but it was all intersected fundamentally. These were aristocrats, right? Another thing you can't stand is when people come up with the idea that the Giulii were poor, right? The fact that these was Caesar came from a decayed nobility. These were some of the single most powerful families in Rome. Moment Caesar's birth, the equivocal was born actually because we lack, as it's normal for these times, and actually even for these times and spaces that are the most dramatically documented in the world at that point. It's the actual magistracies that the Giulii had covered in those years. There is a gap, and we clearly see just by the connections the other magistracies, in the Cursus Honorum and so on, that the Giulii were there, right? We have a clear understanding. These were some of the third or fourth most powerful family in Rome. They were dramatically rich. These began as the upper classes at every level of society, politically, militarily, and at the same time, they were trying to create. To carve out further power on their own, is an attempt fundamentally to monopolize the Roman Republic. The events that brought eventually to the first triumvirate, and then basically the loss of control of the Roman Senate over the Republic, happening basically in 53-52, are substantially the moment in which properly the Republic died as such, and it's just about the clash between these warlords at the end. Crassus was knocked out. We'll see that was important also just for Caesar's further plans against Parthia. But there is to consider here the cultural background of these gentes, the Roman nobility, that can help understanding. Today we'll discuss fundamentally Caesar's dictatorship, but also in the idea of Caesar as a god or as a king, right? and the voices, the spread also after his death, were expressed by later historiography relatively to the fact of, what was in this person's mind. Of course, any sensible historian will say, we do not know, we'll never know. And we have to take very carefully this information, also from times that were, but not dramatically farther away in time, but that had seen very important changes at the political and institutional level, just because of the rise of Octavianus, Augustus, and naturally the think about the divinization, the Divus Caesar, that Octavian made of his uncle, and therefore we can often go as far as saying, that also other figures. Think about Catilina. Right, who was this man? We'll never know, right? Many people rightfully say, Caesar was just a Catilina that had it done, right? That made it in the end. And surely we live in Caesar's image, and for what Augustus left all that. In spite of the dramatic difference that existed between him and his adoptive father, because the question here is not just reading sources through the obvious realization that in those times and for a very long time to come, there is nothing like an overtly and specifically biased source with an agenda. I mean, all sources are biased, but these were written specifically to tell a political narrative that was very strongly oriented from an ideological point of view. So many voices, also the ones we read from Suetonius, and so all the voices that spread about things like, that Caesar was, for example, sick before being assassinated, or even that Caesarion was his son, or the story of the crown, the diadem, it was all staged. I mean, these are all things that people like to make gossip on, but that fundamentally we have no actual historical evidence to assert, right, on the base of the sources we have, that we don't know whether they were actual things, whether the what could be the mindset behind these actions, had they even happened at some point. This is important because what I would like to tell here, maybe introducing the thing a bit clumsily, I realize, is that there was a mental background that is, in my opinion, the single most important thing that, albeit also the single most difficult thing to take into consideration when discussing these figures, as we were saying before. These Roman gentes were fundamentally very loaded with a sense of themselves. They had a responsibility at this point of ruling one of the greatest empires was being born, and the literally the political and social responsibility that these individuals had as heads of properly of their own clans were enormous, right? So there is a bit this idea of that these were all megalomaniac, kind of egoistic, obsessed, bloodthirsty, greedy figures that had no other sense of morality but to achieve power. This is a very superficial interpretation of history, but apparently it's very, very popular, because we need to point out that whoever is at the top is somewhat evil, right? And instead the rest of the people is pure. This especially in a part of the West is a very common feeling, right, when looking at history. Coming from the other side of the aisle, I must say that I do believe that, of course, these individuals had certain tendencies that I would have been dramatically interested to psychoanalyze, but at the same time we forget that this was not an act of will, right? Or better, it might even been, but in a context that pressured them in an unimaginable way, right? So either they did that or they were over, right? So there was no option, and the personal details that we know sometimes also about these figures are actually doesn't matter whether fabricated or not in this sense, but they're trying to to show us that in spite of all, these were actual man, right? Especially in a society like the Roman one, still at this point, that was still about republican ideas, was still about the idea that these were all free, they were all freemen, free Roman citizens. And more than that, when looking at these clan leaders, they were still responsive of their power, but they were men at the end of the day. This dualism is quite important, especially considering the Roman concept of imperium, the idea that their power was conferred from a higher sacral source that naturally had rewarded these men by their virtues that were exemplified by also in terms of political propaganda by these in imposing some of honors and of titles. Caesar, as we will see, will kind of top that. Caesar wasn't such a dramatically he wasn't such an innovative figure, right? He basically collected on himself an astonishing and unprecedented amount of honors, but fundamentally what we see is what was already conferred to both Scipio the elder and the younger, Sulla, Pompey, Crassus, right? He just got more than them, but the one who took the real step forward would be definitely Augustus, with an unprecedented concept of the Principatus and the outspaces of the gods, and how they were passing through his figure, albeit even in there maintaining famously this idea that he was just in fact a princeps, right? What first among equals in theory. So the voices about the divinization are true. There is something to it, evidently, that Caesar wanted to consolidate for maintaining power in a very delicate situation in these last years of his life, because naturally he felt, and we know it pretty well, because nobody, of course, he had an astonishing power. In a sense, he had a regnum in the Roman sense of the term. But even in here, we should distinguish what is a king in our modern language. What is a rex in Latin, for example? The fact that it was not a monarch as we intend him, mostly from the modern political theory, right? This where we kind of began to be obsessed with it, but specifically understanding the fluidity, the flexibility that the term could have, right? It had emerged as a magistracy, among the others, in all its sacrality that, however, pertained. When you were conferred the imperium, Caesar, you had literally, as we were saying before, you had a divine mandate in a sense, so that all the Roman magistracies were passed through this kind of sacral rite. Caesar had important. He was a flamen when he was very, very young. He had the sense of strong, deep sense of religion. As was normal in those times, and especially for the Roman nobility, it could exploit these things. But he had covered, for example, he had detained the imperium through the consulship, the proconsulship, the dictatorship for 10 years in a row, which was unprecedented, right? From 54 BC to his death, even though he had naturally been proclaimed a rebel when he eventually marched on Rome and so on. But the question here is, can we sense better what this ambition could be tied to, even from this cultural background, right? Why would a clan feel, more or less entitled to cover certain offices, roles, and assume certain taking on certain responsibilities? But also trying to understand in here the diversity that existed also between these clans. The idea that it doesn't matter how advanced already Roman civilization was, still the tribal, the also warlike mentality behind these symbols was very, very pronounced, and that what happened definitely during Caesar's civil war, it naturally also had happened before. We'll see now the important connections with Marius, famously enough, in Caesar's family, among the popularis sphere, had, let's say, legitimized his role at power. You understand how much topics that we're going to cover here. I will have to make a video absolutely about the differences between Caesar and Pompey in handling the civil war, because that that's an important lesson in political and strategical matters at that time, not just in Roman history. We'll have to discuss Gallic Wars, which we already did, but we didn't speak very much, for example, about the astonishing success of Caesar as a politician led to war. Caesar wasn't much of a, wasn't one of the top tacticians in Roman history, right? He was one of the greatest commanders, one of the greatest leaders indeed. But even in here, we're talking about a man who had, in Clausewitzian terms, the idea of what war was as an instrument to his end, and the conquest of Gaul is a masterpiece, as well as the taming of the Britons and the Germans as a of counter-insurrectional warfare, right? That he started, presuming old military academies at this point. Was it true, right? Very true, actually. That even in there, such things are studied. Unfortunately, we do lack that in terms of strategical culture and education. I've seen a bunch of stuff that you could find in. Let's skip the military academies, programs, and so on, these issues. But I mean, studying them really shows you deeply the connections between that background we're talking about and war as we eventually come to study, mostly as we come to study. In this, I'm very open also to to give the due to these figures, right? For example, I believe that Pompey was actually a capable politician, military man. People like just to say, oh yeah, he lost, right? There is this idea, he lost, therefore he was, it's not true it was the great, it was just, even here the bombastic thing of the guy that's made or not made is also pretty biased idea. We simply don't know, and the only things we know is that objectively up to that point Pompey had achieved quite interesting things, that it was definitely a rival to reckon. There are also the voices about what about the Parthian campaign that he would have undertaken had it not been assassinated. I mean, talking about Caesar, of course. Even the Dacian one, and naturally all the various successes during the Civil War, also, not just against the Romans, but think about Egypt, think about Pontus, and start thinking even here the dimension, the scope, the horizons of the Roman Republic. Right, at this point, the Roman Republic is still essentially a Mediterranean reality. Even with the conquest of Gaul, there is still an uncertainty which direction the empire would have taken. Right, we made a video especially about this topic, properly the Europeization of the Roman Empire under Augustus. I mean, the concept properly that there was a continental dimension opened, consolidated, and that was to change the history of the world forever. That was taken in Augustus' times. There's still a moment in which everything was flexible because Roman politics was flexible, because nobody understood now what how things would have turned into. And here we're talking about further civil wars that would have opened. Think about when it was the Caesar siege and the ones between Octavian and Antony and so on. So even in here, spaces and political visions that sometimes we have too excessively like to detach, right? Even the following, speaking of Caesar's legacy, because that would become the leitmotif of this, of the following events. I mean, the idea, for example, that Antony was a kind of a Easternophile degenerate that had betrayed Roman custom. We live in the wake of Augustan propaganda. It was a hell of a success. Augustus, I deem it as the greatest politician in the history of mankind. There is no doubt about this. But Antony was much more of a Caesarian than Augustus was in many ways. Octavian had understood this, had seen further. And the fascinating thing is that Caesar was the only one who had recognized what this guy had, right, when he was still a boy. And he really, albeit they were two very different persons, right? It doesn't matter, they shared the same blood, but they had a very different character and nature. What they had in common, they were two very energetic, propositive, independent-minded individuals. This is true, but they had very different parameters. And in fact, what we're studying here in these last years, there are objectively also the only ones in which Caesar could rule Rome, because up to that point, it hadn't been possible, right? Because of all his campaigns. There's also the biological dimension here. He was 56 when he was killed, and yes, the voices about his failing health are just voices that they do not seem to be confirmed. Also because he was really working hard to prepare this further campaign, which make him stay 3 years out of Rome. That's also why actually probably his rivals hurried up to take him out, because at that point he would have basically go out there to avenge Carrhae and Crassus' defeat, and that wasn't against other Romans anymore. So any action taken against him at that point would have been kind of controversial. And also, if he had been actually sick, it would have been known. They would have waited. So that's one of the reasons why I think it was actually not the case. But here we're talking about a Rome that was still, in fact, to be equilibrated. Here, the Romans also were, as we were saying before, kind of undecided still what path to take, right? Consolidating continental Europe, expanding towards the east. We know Caesar's legitimate obsession, like the whole, ancient world, with Alexander, right? Alexander here was the model of everything. Still, Augustus wanted actually to conquer India, famously enough, not just because it was full of Romans at that point. If you look at the temple of Augustus in Malabar, for example, but specifically because there were very understandable political and strategical reasons for wanting to annex those places. But eventually the Roman Empire took another form. We owe it to Augustus in a sense. But what he's been, what Caesar's being criticized by is naturally, this impositive way. I mean, the fact that he had come to rule, even though in a magnanimous way. Of course, these were ruthless, leaders, but at the same time, first of all, look at what Augustus and Antony would have done together after Mutina with the proscriptions and everything. Caesar, as you know, was open. He forgave his adversaries. It was all pragmatic calculation. There is no doubt. But this was also associated, it was coupled with an idea of political culture and a Roman system of values that were there quite cleverly, quite artistically, I would say, mastered by Caesar, who was actually a sensitive person, right? He had a talent, even in literature. He was an extremely highly educated person. He mastered various registers of, if you read the Battle of Galicia, it was in other, the commentari. Those were, for example, written in a fairly simple Latin that was meant also to be propagandistically spread among the masses, but we know he composed some of the most refined lyrics. He was constantly learning. He was a great man, a great aristocrat, a refined man, right? And he lived also personal tragedies. I mean, think about in 54 he lost his daughter. Only daughter and mother in the same year when he was in Gaul still. Think about what it means to feel, and also his accomplishments, his shortcomings, what he's meant to have said in front of the statue of Alexander in Gades was like, I'm your age and still haven't, I am actually older. I don't remember when he was up, but I still haven't accomplished anything of what you've done. And he seems to have felt this, to have in that sense embraced with his spirit an enormous ambition and aim and vision that it's difficult to measure, exactly because we see just a very few years in which he was in charge at the top without fighting and actually administering and ruling. And Caesareanism indeed was not the best solution for Rome, right? We don't know, again, what would have happened had the situation stabilized, but eventually it took other two civil wars to get rid of those elements of Roman politics and society that would have opposed his plans anyway. So I believe this, let's say, autocratic, or at least that's maybe too much in considering that some powers were still conferred, right? So some of the most important ones, but still definitely this symbolism, this important monarchic tendency, might have as well been a response to such a position, right? And that served actually also for later for Octavian for recovering an idea of sacrality that at that point was deep, right? The gens Julia was actually a very old one. It was literally one of the most nobles of Rome. It's true, it wasn't. It had re-emerged at some point, right? It hadn't been straight. It was kind of one of the single most important ones, but definitely at this point had recovered that. Also consider that these clans lived of traditions, of legacies, of that were transmitted over the centuries in a non-crystallized sense, right? Culture was very oral as well. Doesn't matter that Romans were, highly literate since the 4th century BC, just as the society, that even at lower levels. But the question here is that naturally in Augustan times much was crystallized. Think about Virgil's Aeneas that looks at yes, essentially at the beginnings of the Iuli from Iulus himself, son of Aeneas, that in turn son of Venus, right? So a hero proper, and these things were deeply felt, not just by the mob, but concretely the clans that ruled now the city had a way to impose themselves in a world that didn't have much other moral systems other than this ones of heroization. The Roman religion was very complex at this point, right? The archaic one was still standing in some levels, but the same Romans had forgotten in part what it was about. But the proliferation of these gods, semi-gods, heroes, etc., was deeply felt, and they all had a place in that world, and that's why it was a very important ground also where to expand, because there was room for, making order where evidently was not. So, were we to talk about Pompeii, in opposition of Caesar also in these times, we definitely see that, as we said before, he had been a brilliant general, right? He had eminent qualities of chief of staff and great organizer, especially, more than else, of the conquered territories. Some argue that he was kind of not much of a man of state. I doubt it, right? He showed that as well. He basically took control of Rome after Crassus' death, also because literally the city was uncontrollable, right? The Senate lost control completely on it, and therefore, with the they had entrusted power to him, as he had remained the major figure. He wasn't actually much of a strategist compared to Caesar at some point, and his policy of leaving Italy for the East, that is to say, manpower for riches, and is also something that must be understood, not much maybe in Pompey's understanding, but actually of that political pressure. I mean, the idea that Pompey had to feed all these clienteles to all these anti-Caesars now that had coalesced against him, because literally he was trying to coup now just with his armed forces from Gaul, and therefore he needed that money to ensure eventually a post Caesar time had he won, by rewarding them lavishly, not just insisting on a kind of more military capacity, because Italy technically could be defended. Even the resistance of Corfinium was done independently, proved that that would be a hell of a ground where to clash, or at least to keep Caesar occupied. Probably some of the best choices would have been Africa or Spain, right? Actually, remaining in Italy, yes, was a risk, and Pompey did see it right in that regard. But definitely, he had three options: it was either the East or Africa or Spain, and he, in Africa he had all the possibility of blocking Italy from the sea. In Spain, he had the greatest part of his manpower, so that it took eventually Munda to take them out after so many times. In the East, there was just money. Yes, a lot of money, but not enough to do. It's a bit the same problem that Antony would face later on. So he definitely made mistakes, right? Whereas what Caesar actually stands out for, and this is probably one of the single most, the brilliant quality of this man, is the lucidity in calculating the risk and accepting it. I mean, Caesar did. You see, this is a Clausewitzian teaching, if you want. He knew there was a risk. It could be defeated. It could die, right? But he also realized that in those moments, he had an advantage that later on he would have not had, right? So where Pompey actually gave up for immediate security and not thinking much of the afterwards, he always saw very clearly. He decided. He took his time, right? He was a great planner. He was a great organizer too. He reflected. He did the thing, right? Yes, there's the famous Veni Vidi Vici, and also the some hasty actions he took, but just because he was pressured at that point, considered he was defeated, right, more than once. Think about Gergoviev, think about Dyrrhachion, but he had struck the right moment so that he managed, maybe not just, that was mostly their enemies' fault, but we can't not to press on him and crush him, but Gaul would have been conquered by the Romans anyway, because simply the sheer manpower comparatively was level of political cohesion was untenable. Right, Caesar conquered whole Gaul in 8 years, and even basically warned pretty effectively the Germans and the Britons not to even dare to think to interfere in Gaul, and that lasted for a long time. And but Pompey evidently could have maybe pressed on Dyrrhachion. Even here, we don't know how things actually went, but it's obvious also that for the laws of reciprocity, we see in the Clausewitzian theory that he was aware of that as well. So we will never know at which level he managed to play to decide to retreat in time at certain points. But wherever we see he moved, he objectively had a crystal clear vision that others didn't have, and he also took on his own responsibility. I mean, in Munda, he was about to fall on his own sword together with the rest of the high command, as the Romans were meant to do. And that tells you the overwhelming pressure of politics and society on these individuals, right? It was normal for you to kill yourself. Just think, if you ask today's politicians, I mean, it's not because they are politicians, but because it's today, right? We have a completely different mindset. These people were either you take your own responsibility or you die, because it's the gods who decide that, right? So you are here. It's beyond the gods. Here it's a matter of honor that, in my opinion, was a universal value shared on that famous basis we talk about of the religious military meaning standing within the imperium. I mean, the idea that if you lacked, this is very evident, especially in the Achaemenid Aryan tradition. I mean, the concept that you basically can't do anything wrong, because if you do, it's because if you failed, it's because you did something wrong. Even if you did a word wrong, glory descending from the skies will fly back to the heavens because you have been impure, right? And the Romans were still deeply feeling for this, as most peoples out there, and they had a sense of responsibility and entitlement exactly because of that reason. And all the Caesarian political propaganda also reflects this, the idea that he didn't look at kind of divine symbolism just because of the obvious practical propaganda ideological impact it could had Roman policy, but because objectively, you come out there, you crush, you collect 4 triumphs, you deserve something that even a normal man that is not in touch with the gods cannot do. And hence certain representations of this that we will look at. For example, he was the first Roman who had himself depicted on coins in lifetime, his head. And that's something that would become standard since Augustan times. But, for example, to money was associated, to coins was associated with sacral value as well. And the symbolism in it is definitely eloquent about it. We'll see other important controls also on certain religious collegia, right? And all aspects of Roman society and culture must not be overlooked. So as we've seen, what strikes really in Caesar is his temper, right? He was born on July 13th of 101 or 100. I don't remember actually because there is a debate. I've always known 100, but possibly it's 101. Caius Julius Caesar belonged to this most ancient patrician family that in the recent events of the Roman Republic had been allied with Marius, famously enough. As we were saying before, it was first of all either one or the other. The Julii actually had been, clever to maintain also important connections with the Sullan side, right? At 17, Caesar married with Cornelia. It was Cinna's daughter, but he had remained close actually also to other figures out there that would, it was an intelligent thing to do, especially Julia acting like a bit like a wedge in this context because of the instability of the event. He had been persecuted. I mean, in his youth he had to run. Sulla wanted, dead, or at least he had to really escape in the countryside to go undercover. Those were harsh times, right? But as we have seen just here, he mostly connected with the populares and their leaders. The main difference here stood mostly in the idea that was quite evident in Caesar, and that perhaps makes him as one of also the, as Roman emperors would be, this would be clear, one of the greatest leaders in Rome. I mean, the realization that the empire had itself in its capacity of expanding, and therefore sharing its own citizenship to other peoples. The Battle of Galicia is a manifesto to convince the Romans, the Roman nobility in particular, of the necessity actually, of the Gallic Romanization. I mean, the idea that these were, yes, they were barbarians, but not so barbarians, right? And that therefore they could be integrated, were eager actually to participate. Their elites were to be co-opted by Rome and so on. This naturally, the most conservative forces didn't want to hear that. They wanted mostly, they had always had a more conservative idea of just properly of Roman imperialism, because expanding new lands meant, extending more power to single individuals who would rule over them, to actually even give a space in part, not automatically, but Caesar was, for example, he founded Corinth or Carthage, the idea of founding colonies, rewarding the military, right? These had become fundamentally, as we've seen, times of great warlords. After the Marian reform, it wasn't having land to fight, but fighting for the land, and the only ones who could now give new land to the proletari were definitely these warlords who would have to conquer it from other peoples and reward them such. So the populares here are also meant like, the lowest strata of society, incidentally the largest ones, those who had the demographic and probably also military manpower that could support imperialistic policies that, in Caesar's conquest of Gaul are definitely very, very evident. And this would be a bit the winning side. I mean, Caesar, this is just for anecdotally, but not so, still very importantly, he was the one that opened, with his victory, and eventually the one of his heir, with the Giulio Claudian dynasty, the concrete idea that there had to be a balance, at least, between the nobility and the people. The idea that a ruler could, that could rise above the rest of society had naturally to tame most of the nobility and seek support of the populace to concentrate power in his own hands. It's always been, right? Normally monarchs are people-friendly, right? It's the aristocracy that actually doesn't like that would immediately do the same exact thing to get to the top and switch policy. And that's why the hypocrisy of who believes that, even in today's society, attacking a leader or figure. He's like not actually looking at the spectrum of of society itself at all levels, and therefore to expand the empire further, as would happen, right, under Caesar, under Augustus, and some of the greatest emperors that, of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. It was one of the most demonized, considering the bad press they received from Flavian times and all the evil, bias that you could possibly imagine, deriving exactly from that senatorial reactionary side that wrote that history. But those were freaking enlightened emperors. There's not a single Julio-Claudian emperor that wasn't a good one, right? The bad press is just bad press, and people keep, interestingly enough, keep believing it, right? Most as ancient political propaganda, medieval propaganda, is still believed by people today as a proof that, of course, never think that you are more intelligent or more capable than a person who lived 2,000 years ago, because you're most definitely not, and you will never be. But the question here is acknowledging that there was a vision beyond just the personal idea of power, that the idea of extending citizenship to other peoples, famously enough, as we will see, Caesar would do with to Cisalpine Gaul, and securing together with it a very important strategical base that would remain so for centuries to come. But is properly the widening of the horizons of a civilization, right? What most people cannot accept today. I mean, the concept that behind Roman imperialism stands still an idea of legal equality and of idea of earning rights in a civilized context, in a civil context, where you can be equal to another if you deserve to be so, right? And this is something that you can ideally see in a tribal context when you think about the freeing of slaves, etc. But it's something much more, much less evident in a sense, and that succumbed even in the face of Roman expansionism. I mean, how did Caesar conquer Gaul in 8 years? Or could think to do the same with Dacia, like in just one campaign, in one campaign proper. It's obvious because they didn't have political cohesion. They were still quarreling among each other. They might have had even an important manpower to field, but no consistent political military structures to actually channel this successfully. And I think the Gallic Wars are the best example of that, because the moment the Gauls realized that, it was too late, right? And still, there is a narrative there that Caesar made to depict Vercingetorix Rex as, a hero, fundamentally, a tragic hero that had to show the values that the Gauls had within. And probably Caesar respected him, but who knows what he actually thought about them. He was a very diplomatic person. There is that example of the Gustibus, right, in there even has to do with Cisalpine Gaul, right, when he was invited, he went to his friend's house with another friend, and there they cooked food not with olive oil like in the Mediterranean areas, but like in Central European ones, with butter, right? And the Roman guy, I mean, his friend had had come with him to the table, lamented that, and that was an embarrassment for the host, and Caesar said, de gustibus non disputandum est. And that reveals, in the sense that probably Caesar was disgusted at the same time, but he had a realization that, politically speaking, that was another world that needed to be integrated, needed to be accepted, needed to be felt as the next step of what Rome could achieve. And we know that definitely Rome was on the rise in that point. So it's just a banal example, if you want. We could go much further. But this is also to see what specifically goes beyond just the idea of personal power, right? There is properly a political vision that is quite evident from Caesar's work, that is brilliant. It shows an incredible intelligence at that level and capacity of persuasion, and a very subtle one, a very and this is where, I mean, if you ever, of course, the advice here is always read in Latin if you can, because that's mind-blowing, right? We are arrived at the point in Europe where PhDs, the study, even, I don't know, medieval history, do not know Latin anymore. I mean, we have sunk so deep into the abyss that it's almost unspeakable. But the idea is reading these words and not just translations or, criticism deriving from those aforementioned bias. Read what these people were trying to try to contextualize this, knowing a bit more from the history of these people. Even the simplicity of that language is something a nobleman like Caesar would have carefully thought of, because it's not so immediate that he even could even think or to enact something of this kind. Having said this, Caesar, and going back on track, was definitely an enormously ambitious person. Right? Since he was a young man, he displayed this immediately, right? And he was scrupulous. Right? He exterminated hundreds of thousands of people and enslaved more. Right, so when we think of this, it was normal at the time. Like literally, all the same people that he exterminated and enslaved believed the same exact values Caesar believed in, because that's what also normally tribes did on a regular basis against each other from day to night for the entire history of their existence. But still think about the sheer size of even think as a human. Of course, people at the time were exposed to much more, not necessarily, yes, surely violent at some level, but also simply darker society. So they had to build moral antibodies since an early age. But the sheer magnitude of this action, just from a psychological point of view, what mark they could have left, and why a person could do this in the first place. If you stop to it's because he was greedy, or because he was an exile, he was a maniac. You go nowhere, right? I know that many people today feel the need to believe that, feel the need to see the most primitive peoples are somewhat the symbol of naivety and justice and pride and art. That's absolutely nothing to do with that. They as we're saying, they share the same exact values of these. So if you blame the Romans, you can't blame any other people who did exactly the same other thing. This is not to say that it's something we should celebrate, but at the same time, we have to be extremely honest that, if we live in a civilization, it's because somebody took that step, even as bloody as it was, to achieve something that, step after step, managed to build something that we can rely on today, right? So making the quest of, it's Rome, the evil guy, and all the rest, the pure martyrs, is probably one of the single most naive, if not silly, shockingly naive and silly ideas you can come up with. Because it means you know nothing also the peoples that you presume you are actually advocating for, right? Because they believed something that if they had listened to you, they would have spit you in the face for, because a tribal society is a warlike society, is founded on the idea that the stronger prevails. And this is exactly what the Romans were doing by the same standards, right? But also taking that further step of saying, okay, you're elite, you seem to be cooperative. Do you want to get in? Can we make this? Can we stand? Can we share this wealth? Can we expand it together? Yes, this is what Rome did at the end of the day. And it's true that Caesar sometimes exterminated tribes that were positive to them, friendly, allied, because he didn't need them in the political strategical balance at the moment, while others that had rebelled actually were spared because they were needed to fill some gaps. So that's how brutal it is. But if you don't understand that there is a specific logic and rationale for doing that, to save maybe that the whole enterprise, you get nowhere, literally from a moral point of view, in terms of moral standards, and you can understand the difference, therefore, between a civilization and another. When Caesar was 17, as we were saying before, he had himself nominated Flamen of Jupiter, and at 38, he had also himself elected Pontifex Maximus. So he basically made all the religious career possible at the time, and he this had an enormous required an enormous responsibility and also an incredible capacity to measure it, given also the aging here is naturally speaking for Caesar's capacities. He considered that normally the pontifex was a magistracy entrusted to the elderly, right? So think even of the times. Surely there was somebody Roman saying, what times are these? I consider the famous Latin phrase that it's basically the same and not that so far away in time. And that's in fact it, right? That here we're speaking of a republican institution that doesn't quite function anymore. That starts literally, being bent to personal private interests, but still is deeply felt because you see, every step they took, of course, they needed with some they did it with some support, but at the same time, there was had you made a mistake, they would have eaten your life. So the fact that you even made it in the first place through this career is astonishing, and this lets you think a lot about what kind of man he could be. It's also very important to remember the elegy to the gens Giulia that in occasion of the funeral of his aunt Giulia. Funerals were she was Marius' widow, by the way, so you think of some of the highest figures here in the political picture. And as you know, these cultures cared extremely for their ancestry, and Caesar was a quaestor at the time. He pronounced this saying, translating, "My aunt Julia's family is descended on her mother's side from kings, and on her father's side from the mortal gods. For the Marci Reges, her mother's family, descend from Ancus Marcius. The Julii, the clan of which our family is part, go back to Venus. Therefore our blood has both the sanctity of kings who wield the greatest power amongst men, and an association with the reverence owed to the gods, who in turn hold power even over kings." Realize that this is from Suetonius with Iulus, and as the event, this was naturally, like, even from the original legend, there was another name, as it was Ascanius, was changed from the Greek sounding thing to a more to Iulius, the therefore mythical ancestor of the Julii, and from this also the cult that Caesar famously owed to Venus Genitrix, right? To which, in Rome still today you can see the temple of the ruins of, and so in this, given considering Caesar as a massive political talent, convinced since his youth of the fatality of the monarchy, right here the reference to the Marci Reges, right? It's possible to believe that was his character, was identity, his vision, his sense of himself that would have eventually planned his career and his moves. On the other hand, there can be a realistic and opportunistic move that brought him to act because of the circumstances and of his ambitions, aiming to an autocratic power. The point is that it's both, right? It's given the moral resources required to undertake certain achievements, certain enterprises, achieving certain goals, you must believe that you are somewhat chosen. These are societies really believe that the deity has something to do with them, that they can interact with it, that they can, and that all of the actions here that are undertaken have a deep religious meaning, that you come from a background that speaks to you, that lives within you, and that confers you a dignity, right? A sense of honor, of responsibility that must be preserved. publicly, and that otherwise would crush you as an individual, right? You can't accept, you must think about eventually Claudius' scandal, and Caesar refused his wife at that point because he said he didn't accept that she had been involved in the scandal, but that the wife of a true Roman had to be above any suspicion even. It was a pretty clever way of getting rid of also of a person that evidently had or plausibly had been involved in something that but it's there are many fascinating kind of dark provocative sides of Caesar. Here we could talk at length. We're thinking about his connection with Catilina and the fact that he also played for commuting his punishment to from death to actually life in prison. The fact he was probably involved in the, at least he was close to the plotters, right? And his gradual rise to his top. Caesar was meant he distinguished himself in action. He wasn't so. These were full men that they had properly. They were involved in any aspect of Roman society. This isn't the classist, modernistic, moralistic idea of the fat rich guys at the top that do nothing with all the slaves. That these people were directly and personally involved in some of the most of the riskiest endeavors, without which they couldn't be anyone in that world. Therefore, you have to boost yourself with some kind of spirit, of identity, of vision, of belief, because otherwise you can't do it. Right? If you start wondering that you will not make it, if you're not determined, if you not have that particular kind of courage or intelligence, or rationale, you go nowhere. You're crushed. You're done for. Right? This is something that today it's difficult to understand because most people are literally born without backbone. Right? They don't know why they're here. They're bored. They're demotivated. They don't believe in anything. They do nothing all the day long. These men were constantly under pressure, and they had to act or die. Right? And we don't find, in fact, much in these wars, much of these were naturally the guys at the top that were the most pressured and the most acting. But at the same time, what they achieved is remarkable, right? Also, think about Pompeii, right? These people that got into, they resolved certain military situations. They were in first rank. I mean, they earned that at some level. So up to 49. Caesar's principal effort was to avoid the comeback of the civil war, hence the triumvirate with Pompey and Crassus. We'll talk about it some other time. But at the same time, we see that was a preparation for his Gallic campaigns, where he acquired glory and especially economical independency. He had asked for the Illyricum. Eventually, he did. That's why he eventually got also the idea because of he wanted to move to Dacia. Right? We could have had the Dacian Wars of Caesar. If it was Gaul, it was just for not for an accident, but for something that went different. That tells you how resourceful Rome was in thinking, and the guy also for carrying out what they did, conquering a whole chunk of continental Europe, you can say in the blink of an eye, just for coming back to Rome and to rearrange politics as he pleased, or almost actually, and crossing the Rubicon, he took on himself the responsibility of the new civil war. Right, as we were saying before, Pompey committed the mistake to leave Italy. That maybe was, as we've seen, even not such a mistake, but the places where he went were a mistake. Caesar maintained, consolidated his positions in Italy. He promised the plebs the distribution of money. These are all things we will see in separated video in detail. He proceeded to the distribution of grain. Right, he was securing the mob. Right, securing the mob meant to control Rome. So this was a very clever thing. But he also, as we were saying before, took this important step of having voted the Lex Roscia that granted the Roman citizenship to all the freemen of Cisalpine Gaul, therefore creating what you can call Roman Italy from the Alps up to the Messina Strait. And so through this move, he rendered the Cisalpines all his own clients, and especially source of legionary recruitment, because you know that the legionnaires could be only Roman citizens, and Cisalpine Gaul was an importantly militarized province. Would grow exactly in importance. Whoever controlled it would kind of got the upper hand. Famously enough, when Caesar was killed, Antony actually seized control of it. Hence the massive bath of blood of Mutina, and however, Octavian managed to retain it, and this would be the manpower base for eventually also Octavian for the West in general. For this, we can start identifying kind of Italic, Celtic, Iberian chunk of the empire that was kind of more warlike, was less, if you want, less civilized than the East, right? It was poorer too, right? It had also more barbarians pushing at the doors, but at the same time, it was the one that could confer more manpower that would be crucial eventually in some of the most important clashes that would bring Caesar and Caesar's successor to victory. Cisalpine Gaul was Gaul, right? There were naturally Roman colonies of Italics that had been brought there to live and so on, but all the freemen there meant that whoever had inhabited those areas in the centuries before were essentially Celts or Celticized populations that now were full Roman citizens, and naturally this wasn't liked very much by the senatorial elite, to having these what they would deem as barbarians sitting next to them in the Senate. But what do you get in turn? More manpower, more capacity. Rome is expanding. Rome is able to conquer, to crush, to actually stabilize itself after a period of civil wars, and to push forward to conquer other lands and to secure them, right? And even to give as we were saying before, also properly continental dimension to the empire. So after Pompey's death, as you know, to make it simple, Caesar rendered Egypt a Roman protectorate. He added to the empire the province of Africa Nova, that would fundamentally be the kingdom of Numidia that was annexed after Thapsus, where he defeated part of of his Roman opponents that had taken refuge there and had been backed by the Numidians in part. He naturally had conquered the Gauls that stayed, remained under control, and we can see here properly, in fact, the re-equilibration towards the west of the territorial empire of Rome that up to that point objectively had been already importantly shifted towards the east, right? The idea that even look at Pompey, his eastern campaigns, the Romans had gradually looked at Egypt, Crete, these Asia Minor was the favorite place of all the kind of possible corruption for imaginable for the Romans to get into. Also with the media there had been scandals and so on, but objectively it's what we were saying before. Reinforcing this western side of the empire meant to reinforce mostly military control on the same, not sharing with others in a collegial sense, like a senator. The senatorial power wanted these areas just to do what these provinces would to do whatever they liked, right? Augustus would so much, in fact, retain, as you know, that we made a bit about the split between the senatorial and the imperial provinces proper, that were meant, the senatorial lands were the richest, but also the less important in terms of manpower, whereas the imperial ones were in fact, the most militarized, the ones that had probably more strategical value. Some of them, the only exception being Egypt, for the simple reason that it's from most of which the grain supplies came from, that was controlled also by as equestrian prefect. It had a very direct control from the imperial side, to maintain a balance there. Here Caesar, he's partially preparing for that balance to happen, to have a more monocratic power, more centralized power, because at the end of the day This is the point. As long as you have a Senate now, that doesn't even basically work anymore. It's just the clienteles of these major warlords that are more or less tied to that world. You want to create an alternative to that. Rome, up to that point, had objectively expanded mostly into civilized areas, right? Were the richest areas of the Hellenistic world, right? The coasts of the Mediterranean, full of cities, money, trade. Expanding it, giving a continental dimension, right? Subduing peoples that could furnish Rome military clienteles, that could help expand the empire and control new land that therefore wasn't anyone's but those who had conquered it. Hell, goal was Caesar's, right? And you can literally handle them as you like, and therefore add more extra power, centralizing the hands of a single person, differently from what the senators have been used to do in this regularly richer areas of the Mediterranean that, however, didn't have a dramatic manpower. There were less militarized regions in the first place. They already accepted since millennia the rule of, I don't know, it could be the pharaohs, the kings of kings, where you find actually, in fact, more divine reference also to rule, to power, right? Caesar, for example, was addressed like as a god in certain eastern provinces, but basically like other Romans had been at that point. Even Augustus in Rome, he was just a first among equals. He was just a citizen in theory. In Egypt, he was the pharaoh, practically. He was a god, and the question there is important because of the narratives that, in fact, also the Augustan propagandas were saying would give to such moves, to the idea that, for example, choosing the East would be kind of a betrayal of the Roman mores. Antony wasn't an Esterophile or Easternphile, or he wasn't plagiarized by Cleopatra, nor Caesar was at the end of the day, right? Actually, Roman culture was possibly even more misogynistic than the Greek one. When Cleopatra wanted, she was a hell of a woman, right? Let me tell you, and incredibly smart. She wanted to participate in the Council of Wars because she put a stratospheric amount of money into the Roman business enterprise, and the Roman commanders, we were told by sources, looked at her like, in contempt, like a woman that decides what money an army has to. What the hell is that? Well, yeah, she had that power. At the same time, she was just trying to maintain, her kingdom, and she played it very cleverly. But going as far as saying that she was a kind of just a mistress in a contemporary term, we don't even know much about her private life, honestly. But Antony wasn't the vicious, corrupted thing. Octavian played an extremely smart propaganda about that, right? And but actually Antony, as we were saying before, was much more Caesarian than Augustus himself, who had already taken a step forward. If you want completing, and actually fixing more than completing, and actually re-elaborating Caesar's legacy, and even also towards the latter part of his life, detaching himself from it in a more personal direction, because it was really a different thing. Caesar, right? The main criticism maybe can be moved to him is that he at least didn't have the time to show us, even if the prodromes weren't evenly so promising in that sense, given this autocratic formula that truly wasn't perhaps just something. It was just something emergential and that didn't leave room for anything else. Was not able to put things in order, right? Caesar basically remained in power, enormous personal, authority, but at the same time, still surrounded by vicious enemies. In fact, would take him out, and still had many cards to play to restore the old order. And he hadn't fixed that, right? As the civil wars would prove afterwards. So never think that Caesar actually had it done, right? He ruled for too few years to see the things done. He actually played cleverly, but you realize that he was still trying to maintain the balance. He wasn't creating a new order like Augustus did, right? And even him had to fight hell. as he had, right? At least had to defeat his enemies. But it's worth noticing, and I promise we will make a very important video about that, because that's quite misunderstood usually. Properly the connection there with Caesar, because we still believe what Octavian wanted us to believe, and that's how smart the guy was. But we could we say that Caesar, as we were saying before, that he actually had a regnum, that he was actually a rex de facto, right? Because from 46 to 44 BC, he was objectively the Roman lord, right? If you accept the term of lordship in the, with all the anachronism of the terminology, but yes, we're speaking of warlords. Look at the first triumvirate. He was the only one left, and he assumed control of Rome. He was out-related of the prestige of his victories. He accumulated enormous honors. First, with his 4 triumphs that were the ones on Gaul, on Egypt, on Pontus, and on Africa, right? As we were saying before, take to consideration the dimension here, and the areas which Rome was beginning to look at more uniquely, especially. Yes, these were all, in fact, as we were saying before, Rome had maintained mostly coastal possessions at this point. Now it's something going slightly beyond, right, in securing especially the African hinterland, Gaul, right, but also looking at Pontus as a Pontic dimension, the Ukrainian steppes, the Caucasus. It was even said that before leaving for Rome, but this is just a voice, that he should have invaded Parthia, that touring around the Caucasus, so basically in the steppe, and then going against Germany and Gaul. Obviously, this is fantasy, but and against his careful pre-planning. But these are kind of the ideas that were into Roman's mind at some point. Egypt, that was not just one of the richest lands of the Mediterranean, but properly the key of access for the Red Sea, for India, via sea at least, the gold of also, if you think about the African markets, especially the Horn of Africa and so on, ivory, all the those were also, again, we should make a video about this singular spaces, because also the trade routes, the economical needs here must be very carefully analyzed. Caesar celebrated these triumphs in August and September 46 BC, where it's also mentioned Jubas, Scipio, and Cato Uticensis that had been defeated at Thapsus, and eventually even a 5th triumph in October 45 over the Pompeians at Munda. It was kind of more embarrassing because it wasn't against it was against Romans, right? There wasn't another people that was backing them, right? It wasn't just the Eastern kingdoms backing the Pompeians or the Numidian. No, that was just the finest Pompeian legionnaires and veterans that, had they been unleashed at the beginning, might have actually overturned the situation in the civil war, and where Caesar risked to be annihilated himself on the occasion. But however, you realize that after 5 triumphs, you have such the people were galvanized by this man. It was something incredible, and it was real, by the way, right? It wasn't faking the outcome. Doesn't matter how bloody certain victories had been in terms of of losses from the winner's side, but this was still a thriving moment, of course, in the Roman Empire. And by the way, if you ever wonder, and of course I'm saying Roman Empire because there is not such a thing like that Augustus created the empire, right? That's just an approximation we use historiographically speaking, but the empire in Rome begins ever since there is an imperium in the first place. Others, including myself, start talking about the Roman Empire specifically in the moment in which the first provinces were established outside of Italy, because at the end of the day that's what more or less technically an empire is, but this is not even true. I mean, it all depends on what definition you're gonna get, because also the Romans had a very we're talking about times in which the terminology matters, to not to create ambiguities with modern contemporary terms, but at least that's the approximation we use. And there are monuments that are multiplying for Caesar's victories. The Senate was very careful at this point to they were decidedly voting, but without deliberating, right? So they were actually cooperative, but at the end, of course, they were hostile to him. He had. This is also a very important part of his policy. As you know, he has forgiven most of his of opponent. I mean, he had given at least a chance to surrender, to be forgiven, to come back in Rome. Because what he needed was that unity. He needed that part of Roman society as well, right? It's not like Augustus that literally killed everybody who was rich enough to fund his pockets, right? He without any mercy, together with Antony. At this time, yes, there were bloody things happening even at that point, but at the same time there was still the idea of a unity, right? The need of a cohesion, of a concord happening between this society. And that reflected also the ambiguity, the flexibility, the adaptive capacity of the various leaders, right? Think about, Brutus, as he even appeared in Caesar's testament, right? So it was even Antony was probably asked to participate to Caesar's assassination. He knew, surely he played a bit of a double game, but that was normal, right? And Caesar knew everything, of course. He had spies everywhere, but everybody knew, right? You have to realize also how the permeability of information really was about, especially within the city, where all the old wealth, all the clans were concentrated, right? So, I mean, the wealth in the sense of, the control over the empire's wealth was concentrated and directed from. And Caesar, in all this, gradually had his powers completed by the Senate, right? And in 46, he's attributed dictatorship for 10 years. In February of 45, Senatus Consultum actually proclaimed him dictator for life. It's a big deal, right? And after his triumphs, he lived in an almost royal apparatus. He had this calf-length boots in red leather that was typical of royal symbolism, the red-purple toga, right, mantle, and the laurel crown, right, that at some point he also was of gold. Also his crowns were always more encrusted with precious stones. On the money, it's represented his effigies that was a royal prerogative, right, and sometimes even with a golden crown. So the oath of fealty also was done in his name, was a privilege reserved to Jupiter himself. So when you look at monarchic prerogatives, he had the privilege of this polyaopima. His statue was placed on Capitol next to the ones of the 7 kings. He also received the title of Parens Patriae, so father of the country. And he presented himself as a new Romulus, therefore refounder of the Urbs, right? This was a problem that would be also religiously solved by Octavian, by Augustus, when he, in the Res Gestae, explicitly says that the gods were basically speaking through him, and the reason being he had managed to, through the imperium, of reconnecting the empire, the empire unity, because the Roman unity had been broken. So the idea of restoring the universal order that Rome was thinking for itself, because the Romans were absolutely certain of the fact that they would have conquered the world. Like the Romans were, they felt they were the chosen people, They had no other horizon. They were that, and they were accomplishing that objectively. So these are all characters that reveal somewhat a sort of ambiguity, right? Even the title of Parens Patriae, for example, couldn't be proclaimed publicly. This is all shaded. This is all more of a sum of privileges than a full institutional recognition of his power, of a sound power, right? It's not the creation of a new title. It's not the creation of a new figure, of a new order, of a new balance, right? This is basically Caesar trying to put things together after this disruptive civil war, and seeking the support of also various elements of Roman society, the same senators and their clienteles, also the same men who had fought against at some point. And therefore it was said, yes, he lacked the diadem of the Hellenistic sovereigns. There's the famous episode with Antony during the Lupercalia trying to crown him, and he refused twice, and the people went crazy. They acclaimed him because here he said that referring to Jupiter, that Rome had just one Rex, right? And that is, many people say, it's all staged, and not so much, because if he really had wanted to show off like that, he would have done it in a more appropriate way. This was done in a banquet. We don't know what Antony had in mind doing that, or whether they really planned it or not. But the question is that still these are kind of voices. When you read the historiography, you realize these are all kind of posterior stuff. It's written for the sake of highlighting how powerful the guy had become, and this in a time where the Augustan legacy had made of Caesar already a god, right? After his death. So the question here is always focusing on the context of the information we receive, and in my opinion, Caesar wasn't this. If we look at their behavior, we have actually lots of information here about what he did in last years, where he went, where he spent his life. There are very interesting accounts, from Cicero especially, that show actually a person who was extremely busy preparing the campaign against Parthia. He gathered something like 16 legions to launch that expedition. It's not clear whether he might have passed through Dacia first, subduing it swiftly, and was at least thinking to do so, and then going to Parthia. Nobody actually knows whether to actually conquer it, to crush it, or just to inflict a crushing victory to the Parthian king, because at the end of the day, you know what the problem with Parthia was. The Romans crushed it twice, but it's not that they could occupy the Iranian plateau. So this Parthia was between like a state and a feudal reality. So naturally the two things pertained respectively to Mesopotamia and in the Iranian plateau. So you could crush Mesopotamia, or you could tame the Parthians for a while. You could make all those Parthian noblemen rise against their kings that they cried because they were ferociously clashing. Parthia was still a relatively fresh power that hadn't centralized, consolidated unity, and so on. But there were always this pain in the behind, because they choked like the continental route of the Silk Road. And what can you do about that, right? Octavian would mostly play with diplomacy and threat of force. Antony, just a few years after this, actually was defeated by the Parthians. His campaign against Parthia went down miserably. Yes, we often, maybe not forget, but it's need to be reminded that the Parthia wasn't a dramatically powerful reality, right? They just were. They made an incredible amount of mistakes, and also they were at a certain level politically and strategically, can say inept, but they made a lot of mistakes. They blew lots of opportunities to exploit even the Jewish revolts fully. But there is one thing you gotta give, that they didn't quit. They wouldn't quit. They always believed that the Near East had to be theirs. So it doesn't matter how much they were crushed by the Romans, but they the admission of such problem was that the Parthians wouldn't fight an open battle, right? They wouldn't risk that, and that is a proof that it's a hard form of war. I mean, guerrilla and this kind of passive resist, but let's say passive resistance is wrong to as a concept. I mean, this idea of scorched earth strategy and not really getting ever done, but just molesting it. But it's still the implicit admission that they couldn't do much else, aside from the prejudices from which they were mocked, that them as peoples originally from the steppe, they didn't know how to wage a siege, that just the Sassanids would acquire that through Roman engineering, turncoat engineers, military engineers. But the problem from the Roman side was, what the hell do we do with these guys? Yeah, you go there, but against whom are you fighting? Right, these horse archers retreat and bring you into places where they can put you to the corner, as it had happened at Carrhae, right, where actually it's Crassus that kind of screwed up badly in terms of command. It's not because of a specific not that the Parthians didn't have a tactical formula that the Romans were incapable to cope with, right? Carrhae went wrong because the Romans sent cavalry, Gallic cavalry ahead. Those were ambushed and taken out, and therefore, without cavalry, just pinned down by the horse archers in this hell of a land without water, and you go down, not because there is a tactical formula there, because the horse archers were the best. The Romans overly dramatized the thing, and we still believe that, but actually the Romans proved capable to cope with that pretty well, right, on multiple occasions, so they always had the upper hand. But we often these are technologistic prejudices, right? It's not the composite bow that makes a victory or a defeat, right? And that's also not, armies are not wiped out by missile only, but not even cataphracts and horse archers combined are an unwinnable solution. They're basically effective as other tactics, right? And war battles outcomes are determined by other, way more important matters, and way more complex to manage too. So in terms of command, that's why it's crucial, not because there is a specific tactical asymmetry. The question here is, what would have Caesar done eventually remains unknown, or that was probably his plan, because he was meant to leave in a while before he was assassinated. But in terms of his Hellenistic goals, well, definitely a campaign in the East was following the footsteps of Alexander, in a way or another. And many say, well, it's better he died that way, actually, than risking maybe to be bogged down in a Parthian campaign. Well, considering the forces and the supplies, the logistics he was putting, to making up to attack the Parthians, and all the information he gathered on his enemy, that he never lacked that capacity. Caesar, consider, even from a biological point of view, being born, he was 56 when he would have left and died instead. And he had been fighting for a considerable part of his life. He was probably not to be, he might have lived another 15, 20 years, let's say, or even more. We don't have evidence that his health was fading, right? So had he maintained his lucidity, his capacity, his great individual energy always displayed, he might have accomplished great things in the East. But at the same time, it might have also been maybe the beginning of it would have not been necessarily a clamorous success, right? As the other, it was at least a risk he had to consider in this imperial mindset, where if you achieved a half victory, you all of a sudden didn't deserve any more much of the empire, and the you can imagine what his opponents would have exploited this, like ideologically speak, right? And because naturally also Caesarianism took a toll over society, right? The people were rewarded in a way, but still they had suffered consistently. It wasn't a joke to have mobilized, I don't know how, we were talking about millions, right? All together with the last wars, with the participation, even just from a demographic point of view, of the Roman, able-bodied males to the civil wars had been astonishing. Of course, it would grow mostly. I think a million was reached also with the ensuing civil wars. But I mean, this were pretty unstable, and consider that even between Caesar's civil war and Marius and Sulla, a lot of other things had gone on, right? It hadn't been so easy to that there had been other revolts, other campaigns. So these are systems. Doesn't matter how Rome was flourishing and had unlimited, could say, at least for the needs they had, manpower, resources, especially after the Marian reform and this happy moment of expansion and so on. But the system is still hit hardly, right? And people have to pay for that. And definitely also the rise of these warlords in Roman society does correspond to a general impoverishment of the lower classes, right? At least maybe here it's delicate to tell. I mean, at least the political capacity of them. Of course, there is a middle class that in Rome, in fact, would be kept alive by this same Caesar's heirs as part of that militaristic, also more, in fact, kind of inclusive policy of like citizenship extension and so on, accompanied by military expansion, against the senatorial luxus, the stagnant latifundious system, in comparison to the more the nobility holding all the power, the wealth, and the other classes being ousted and therefore taking away, but that a middle class that still had a room to expand in the ancient world. Not much, not dramatic, not so thrivingly like, I don't know, the medieval mercantile society, but still importantly to support certain activities, certain productions. And at the end of the day, as we were saying before, these Roman noblemen were all a bit the same thing, right? They shared the same values, the same lifestyle. They, this was just shifting the balance enough to achieve power, exploiting one or the other model. And we'll talk more about this. And I don't know, because talking about Caesar is always complicated, right? It can't be done easily in a few words, but at the same time, it's important to get acquainted to it, to expand, to reflect, because it's not so obvious as a figure, in terms of interpretation and the controversy of it and so on, and always try to be impartial. Try to be. Right, but make an effort to what also the values, the mentality, the moral system of this world could be, and look at who these people were, and once again, never think that you're actually better, that you can't do something more than these people did in their places, and that would be a pretty healthy thing to do for everybody. The question is also being trying to be to avoid a moralistic attitude, right? To avoid being pretending you can judge from the top, that you know how it was, that you feel your guts. I don't think so. I've heard that guy, or my cousin told me all this. But you should make the effort of realizing that this is stuff that we don't even for everybody who knows the historiography, the sources of this, we stop to that, right? It may be complicated. Surely, having gotten a degree in ancient history helps, but it's never enough alone, especially. But you can't cover in your lifetime, or actually much less, the sources for these figures, right? Also, maybe not the old everything that has been written historiographically, but literally it's always the same sources. I mean, the interpretation can change. You can see more deeply into it, but still, it's just like what Suetonius said about the funeral speech of Caesar's uncle. Well, that's it, right? It's those words, and you can connect it with tons of other stuff, but at the same time, there's just a few you can speculate on at the end of the day, right? The best thing you can do is to complete the picture, to complete the puzzle, and to therefore have a better perspective of the context that we're talking about. And when you realize that, you can't top these topics, because that's what you need, right? Well, whatever. I know that these videos will arise, complications, kind of recriminations and stuff like that, because as I was saying at the beginning, everybody seems to have their own opinion. I have too, as you understand. But one thing is having an opinion, one other thing is backing it with the thing, right? And it's easy to make mistakes, always. Who knows how much I make. But I can at least tell you that this happens, and therefore I can be, let's say, my conscience can stay satisfied in that regard. Well, anyhow, for now we really stop. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.